April 29th, 1945, Berlin. I remember the sound before I remember the faces. The city wasn't breathing anymore. It was trembling. Every building groaned like it was alive, wounded, dying with us. You could taste the smoke even in your sleep, and when you woke up, it was still there, in your throat, on your skin, inside your clothes. It smelled like burnt iron and fear. They said we were defending the fatherland. But what was left to defend? The streets we grew up playing football on were now rivers of rubble. The posters of the Führer still hung on the walls, but the eyes in those posters looked as tired as we were. Even the air had stopped believing. I was 16. My name was Hans Müller, and that week I stopped being a boy. When the call came to join the Volkssturm, no one asked if I wanted to fight. They didn't ask any of us. They came to the schoolyard with rifles and papers, and we signed our names because we were told to. Some of my classmates still wore their school uniforms under their new armbands, black fabric with a trembling swastika that no longer meant power, only desperation. My mother cried that night. She didn't beg me not to go. She just said, "Bring your father's scarf. It's cold down there in the basements." She said it like she already knew I wouldn't come back. When dawn came, I walked through the ruins toward our assigned sector, a few blocks north of the Tiergarten. Soviet artillery was already pounding the city. The ground shivered beneath every explosion. It wasn't courage that kept me moving. It was inertia, the same force that keeps falling stones from stopping. There were 6 of us in our group, none older than 18. We were supposed to hold the corner of a street that didn't even have a name anymore, only a pile of stones and a half-collapsed tram. Our commander was an old man named Fischer, a veteran from the First War. He limped and coughed blood, but he still saluted like he was standing before an emperor. He looked at us and said, "Berlin will not fall, not while there's one German left standing," but his voice cracked at the word standing. That afternoon, we waited behind a barricade of broken doors and sandbags. We had 2 rifles, 1 Panzerfaust, and a handful of bullets. None of us knew how to use the launcher properly. Fischer tried to teach us, but his hands were trembling. Still, we pretended we understood because we didn't want him to see our fear. There was a moment of silence, rare, almost sacred, just before dusk. The sun, if you could call it that, was a blood-red smudge behind the smoke. I remember thinking it looked like the eye of something that had watched too much suffering. And in that silence I realized no one was coming to save us. Not the army, not the Führer, not God. Only the noise was faithful now. That's when I heard it. The distant rumble of tanks. The sound crawled through the streets like thunder underwater. We looked at each other and no one spoke. The sound got louder, closer, heavier. My hand started shaking so badly I almost dropped the rifle. That's when I thought, if you're still here, still listening, don't look away now, because this is where everything changed. The next minutes turned boys into ghosts. And if you ever wonder what the end of a world sounds like, it sounds like that. The rumble of steel, the heartbeat of fear, the sound of the end. If this story already made your chest tighten, stay with me. There's more you need to hear. The things we saw in those streets, they weren't just war. They were the death of childhood. April 29th, 1945. Berlin again. A different hour. The same sky of ash. I learned that a day can crumble into 3 or 4 separate lives when the artillery refuses to sleep. Morning me was a boy. Afternoon me was a soldier. Night me was a ghost wearing a helmet. We were 6 around that corner of stone and splinters, and I can still name them because names were the last things we owned. Emil, who always hummed the same tune from a church hymn he half remembered. Lucas, who had a smile that didn't fit the ruins, a smile that looked like it belonged to summer. Otto, who claimed he had fired a Panzerfaust before, though the way his hands shook said otherwise. Franz, small and sharp-eyed, quick with his words, slow with his fear. Peter, the oldest at 18, who wore his father's wedding ring on a string around his neck like a talisman against death. And me, Hans, 16, carrying my father's scarf and a heart that didn't understand the decisions my body was being forced to make. They told us we were Volkssturm, the people's storm. It sounded like something out of a book with banners and sunlight. But when they handed us our rifles, the wood was cracked and the oil smelled tired. The armbands itched. The bread crusts they pushed into our palms were a day older than yesterday and tasted like dust and salt. We stood in the rubble like children at the edge of a river, pretending we knew how to swim. Fischer, our commander, arrived with a cough that seemed bigger than him. He was from another war, a war of trenches and telegrams, of horses that went mad under shell fire. He watched us with those grey, sea-weathered eyes and said we were brave, and the word sounded fragile in his mouth. He gave Otto the Panzerfaust and made us practice loading and aiming without firing. The tube was heavy and smelled of metal and grease, and the fins of the rocket scraped against Otto's coat as if impatient to leave. Otto nodded at the instructions, but I could see that he was far away, on a field, on a road, somewhere that wasn't this street where every window looked like an open wound. Berlin taught us sounds. The big guns from across the river hit deep, a drum in your ribs. The medium guns cracked the edges of buildings, stung your ears. The mortars were like teeth biting down on bone. And the tanks weren't a sound so much as a decision made by the earth to move toward you. When they rolled, it felt like the city had a heartbeat again, but an enemy heart beating inside our own. We took turns peering through the rabbit hole we'd punched in a fallen door, watching the empty street that wasn't empty. Somewhere in there were men we couldn't see yet. Men wearing uniforms that were just as human as ours. Men who had mothers who had packed their scarves and kissed their foreheads. We had been trained to imagine them as a red wave without faces. But the closer they came, the more that idea fell apart. It's harder to hate a wave when you can count the fingers of the hand rising from it. By noon, the shells fell like angry hail around the tram carcass in the intersection. Glass leapt from windows and turned to rain you couldn't dry from your hair. We huddled together and counted, because counting was something besides fear. 10 shells, 15, 20. With each one, the barricade shed a layer of itself, and the sandbags sighed out their dust like old men giving up secrets. Emil kept humming. He didn't know he was doing it. It trembled out of him like the way leaves quiver when the wind asks them to. I tapped his elbow and he started, blinked, and apologized like he'd spilled something precious. I told him it was all right. In that moment, anything human was all right. The truth is, we believed and we didn't. We believed because we were told to, and because there is a comfort in belonging to something larger when the world breaks. We didn't believe because we had eyes. We saw the lines of refugees moving like a grey river, carrying everything they could hold, pulling children along who didn't understand the word front. We saw the posters peeling from the walls, the faces on them turning into ghosts under the damp. We saw the way the men in black uniforms looked through us, over us, as if we were already stories told by someone else. There was a radio in a nearby basement that still worked if you jiggled the wire and prayed to a god with electricity in his hands. Sometimes we tuned in for the speeches. The voice that came out was smooth and sharp, like a blade that never cut itself. It said the city would hold. It said reinforcements were coming. It said our sacrifices would be remembered. It said many things a voice can say when it doesn't have to look anyone in the eyes. We listened because we had to, and then we switched it off because we had to breathe. If you're still with me, stay. Don't leave me here in this corridor of smoke and prayer. Stories like this don't belong to museums. They belong to the living, to anyone whose heart has ever mistaken fear for duty. If you want to carry this with me, if you want more of these human corners of history, hold on tight. There's a reason I'm telling you now. Toward evening, a boy in a Hitler Youth uniform skidded around the corner, panting, hair stuck to his forehead. He was maybe 14, just a year or two behind me, but far younger in the ways that count. He held a message folded like a tiny white coffin. Fisher opened it and nodded, then nodded again, as if the paper had asked him a question. He rolled it up and slid it into his pocket. "We hold this street," he told us. "We hold the bridge to the south if we can reach it by dark. They'll try to punch through to the center by morning." Peter asked what everyone else was thinking. "With what?" he said, rubbing the ring against his collarbone. "We have one rocket." "With that," Fisher said, pointing at the Panzerfaust, "and with your legs, you will move fast. You will use the corners. You will not be heroes. Heroes are statues, and statues always crack." We moved at dusk. The world turned the color of ash and wine. Our boots found the soft places in the rubble and slipped where the plaster turned to powder. We passed a bakery that had become a skeleton, its ovens cold as tombs. We passed a toy shop with its windows blown open and wooden soldiers scattered across the street, their painted eyes staring up at a sky that had forgotten how to be blue. We passed a woman standing at a pump, cranking water into a bucket with a rhythm that sounded like a heart refusing to stop. She looked at us and then away. I realized then that our armbands were not just colors, they were warnings. At the bridge, there were 2 soldiers from the regular army left, and they looked at us the way men look at rain that's too late to save the harvest. They showed us where to crouch, where the stones at the parapet were thickest. "They'll come from that street," one said, nodding toward a row of buildings without faces. "You'll hear them before you see them." As if we could ever stop hearing them. We waited again, because that was most of what war was for us. The waiting that turned you into a question. We learned each other's breaths. We traded sips from a bottle of something that might once have been schnapps and was now courage, watered down. Lucas told a story about the lake where his family would swim in summers, how the reeds whispered at the shore and the fish nudged your ankles like kittens. He told it so quietly I had to lean in to hear, and when he finished I realized he hadn't told it for us to know the lake. He had told it so the lake would know we were still here. Then the tanks came, not all at once. First the street tensed, as if it remembered it had been a road before it became a scar. Then a shape appeared, black against the red-grey dusk, a low beast with a jaw of steel. You can't mistake a tank for anything else. It moves like a verdict. We crouched lower, and Otto clutched the Panzerfaust, like a child clutches a nightmare to make it end sooner. I felt my fingers go numb, and then felt them again too much. I thought of my mother's hands, the way they smelled of soap and onion, and the coins she kept in her fist for luck. I wondered if she was in the basement listening for the same sounds, counting breaths that had my name on them. I wondered if she was already practicing what to say to the neighbors when the war took me, how people find words for things that don't have words. The first tank reached the mouth of the street and paused, and for a heartbeat I thought it was listening to us. Then it exhaled fire. The shell hit the far wall of the bridge and threw us backward as if we were made of paper. Franz shouted. I couldn't hear the word because hearing had been cancelled for a moment. Dust became air. The sky moved closer. Now, Fisher said, or maybe his mouth said it and we guessed the rest. Otto didn't move. He was frozen in a prayer that had forgotten every word but one. No, I don't know why I did what I did next. There are moments when a body becomes a stranger, and you watch it as if it belongs to someone else, someone braver, or someone more foolish. I grabbed Otto's sleeve and pulled, and the Panzerfaust came with us, and we stumbled to the corner, and for a second the sight line was clear, the tank's flank, close enough to see the welds, the paint, the faint handprint of the man who had touched it last. Here, I said, though I couldn't hear myself. I braced the tube on the parapet and pointed and prayed to no gods because I didn't have time to choose one. Otto blinked and breathed and nodded, and I felt his shoulder press against mine like we were two parts of a single animal, deciding whether to run or to bite. He aimed. He fired. The rocket leapt like a scream that had found a throat. It crossed the distance between us and the world with a speed I still can't understand. And then there was a flower of flame on the tank's side, orange and black, blooming into a noise that broke apart the night. The tank jerked. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the hatch opened, and a figure climbed out, arms wide, silhouette cut from fire and smoke. He was on fire. He was a man. He was a boy. He fell. The second tank didn't pause. It rolled forward as if death were a minor inconvenience. It dragged the body away, with a sound I will not describe because I don't have the words and you don't need them. It fired again. The bridge groaned, and we groaned, and the city added the sound to its collection. We had no second rocket. The regular soldiers fired rifles that made the night flicker and did nothing else. The bullets sparked and skittered like nervous insects. We pulled back behind the bridgehead, and the stones we had trusted to be solid suddenly seemed to be made of the same fabric as fear. More figures appeared behind the tanks, fast and low, like thoughts you can't catch. They wore helmets different from ours, and they shouted in a language that might as well have been thunder. One of them was close enough that I could see stubble on his jaw, the way his breath fogged in the cooling air. He looked my age. He looked older. He looked like a mirror that had been smashed and glued back together wrong. I did not fire. I wish I could tell you I did, that I did the thing that was expected from the stories told after wars are over. But my finger refused the trigger like a mouth refuses spoiled milk. I watched him skid behind the tram carcass and vanish, and for a moment the war collapsed into a single fact. There was someone over there who wanted to live, just as much as I did, and the only thing between us was a line of air and a set of orders written by men who weren't here. I want you to understand this, not to excuse, not to accuse, but to understand. We were made into weapons and then asked to aim ourselves at boys we would have been friends with if the world had been normal. If any of this is waking something in you, if your throat is tight, if your hands are cold, then stay. Let this story find a home with you. If you believe these smaller human truths matter, if you want them told, if you want to hear more of the ones that were never written in the big books, keep listening, keep close. It helps more than you think when you carry it forward. Night fell like a lid. The tanks didn't push over the bridge. They waited for more, or maybe they were ghosts checking to see whether we would haunt the place without coaxing. We slid back from the parapet and crawled into a basement with walls that sweated and a ceiling that had opinions about gravity. A family was already there, silent, lined up on a bench like prayers folded in half. A little boy clutched a wooden horse with one wheel missing and watched us as if we were something the river had brought in. His mother nodded to us and then to the crackling stove where something thin was boiling. She offered us a cup, and we took it, because a cup held out in the dark is sacred. Fisher leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. In the flicker, he looked like a statue that had learned how to breathe. "In the other war," he said, voice like gravel, "we used to sing at night. It made the rats curious." No one laughed. "Sleep," he added, "one by one. We'll need whatever parts of tomorrow still belong to us." I tried. In the cave of my mind, sleep wandered the tunnels and didn't find me. I saw the man on fire, climbing from the hatch, arms wide as if to embrace the night before it killed him. I saw the face of the soldier I hadn't shot. Then I saw Lucas's lake, the reeds whispering hello to ankles, the fish bumping like small jokes. I reached for that water with my hands and felt only the grit of the floor. At some hour that wasn't a number anymore. There was a noise above us, a shuffle of boots across a floor that didn't exist. Peter and I went up the stairs slow, holding our breath between our teeth. The street was a painting smeared by a clumsy hand. Smoke moved in rolls, fat and indecisive. In the middle of the bridge, a figure lay face down, and I thought at first it was a sandbag that had lost its friends. Then the wind turned it a fraction, and the pale triangle of a cheek appeared. A helmet lay beside it like a fallen halo. Peter looked at me, and the ring flashed dull in the dark. "We can't," I whispered. "There." I gestured toward the other end of the bridge, toward the place where the tanks had been, toward all the places that could hold eyes. "They're watching." He didn't answer. He slid over the parapet and onto the bridge, his shoulders moving with a patience that insulted the night. He crawled the way a prayer moves along a rosary, quiet and careful and stubborn about reaching the end. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to go with him. I did neither. I watched, and every second took a bite out of me. He reached the figure and took its shoulder and rolled it gently. Not one of us. Not one of them either. A woman, hair cut short under the helmet, face young in the way faces are young before the world writes on them. A medic's armband stained into something that wasn't red anymore. She had been trying to cross, to get to someone, to get away from someone. She had fallen in the center of the city, the way a question falls at the center of a conversation that no one is brave enough to finish. Peter slipped the ring from his neck and pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it and then opened them again and took it back. And I saw that even in this, he didn't know what the right thing was. He lifted her a little and dragged her toward the parapet. I went to him then because watching had turned me into a coward in my own eyes. We pulled her over the edge and lowered her into the shadow and lay still, as if the world might think we were additional stones. She wasn't breathing, or she was breathing in a place I couldn't find. Fisher came and squatted and put 2 fingers at her throat and then moved them somewhere else and then somewhere else, as if there might be a secret door we could open if we pressed hard enough. He shook his head once. The family in the basement watched, and the boy's horse knocked against the bench in a small wooden rhythm. We buried her behind the bakery skeleton because it had once made bread and was the closest thing to mercy nearby. We didn't dig far. The earth was tired of opening. We placed the helmet above the mound, and Franz whispered something that might have been a prayer or a memory or a line from a song he'd forgotten most of. I realized with a quiet shock that we were practicing being the kind of men we had been told we already were. There is a difference. Down in the basement again, Dawn trying to be born somewhere beyond the stones, Emil asked if we would run when the tanks returned. He didn't ask it to shame us. He asked because answers are all that keep fear from eating the room. No one spoke. Silence is often a lie that people forgive. Then Fisher said, "We will not run, we will move." He held our eyes one by one. Running is when you are chased by your fear. Moving is when you carry it with you and put it down where it will do the least harm. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to ask him where he had put his fear in the other war. I wanted to ask him if it had stayed there, or if it had followed him home and slept at the foot of his bed like a loyal dog. Instead, I said, "What if they're boys too?" The words were smaller than I meant them to be. They broke in the air and fell between us. Fisher closed his eyes for a breath that traveled a long way and came back. "Then we'll be careful where we aim," he said. "And we'll remember." He looked at me as if I had asked something he had been waiting to answer for 20 years. "If this is where your heart is breaking a little, don't look away. Hold this with me. If you want more voices like ours, if you want to hear the parts of history that bleed quietly, stay close and share the listening with others who might understand. It matters more than anyone tells you. Morning finally happened. It didn't rise, it limped. The street took off its night and put on a lighter shade of grey. We ate the last of the bread and pretended it tasted different now that the sun was a rumour again. Otto cleaned the launcher as if it would grow a second rocket if he was gentle. Franz counted the bullets we had and then didn't say the number because we already knew it was too small to matter. Peter rubbed the ring until it gleamed and then tucked it back under his shirt as if light were a substance he could store. We were still only boys. But the city had started to teach us its last lessons, and those are always the kind that stay. Stay with me into the next hour. Stay for the fire and for the silence that follows it. Stay because what happened on that bridge and in those rooms is not just mine. It belongs to anyone who has ever been told to be brave when all they had were hands made for holding, not for letting go. The morning after the bridge felt quieter than it should have been. That kind of silence is never peace. It's the pause between two breaths, the space where even the air is afraid to move first. Berlin didn't stop. It just waited, like an animal that had learned what the next sound meant. We sat inside that basement for hours that pretended to be days. Fischer cleaned his hands with a rag that never got clean. The rest of us stared at the walls as if they could answer us. Somewhere above, glass cracked and dust drifted down like slow snow. No one wanted to speak about what had happened the night before. When people have seen too much, even words start to flinch. Peter tried to smile, that small, tired smile that said, "We're still here." He shared what was left of a chocolate bar, passing it piece by piece. The taste was faint, like a memory, but for a moment we were back in the world that had existed before uniforms and orders. It's strange how the smallest things, a bit of chocolate, a smell, a laugh, can remind you that you're still human when everything else tries to make you forget. I thought about my mother again. I could almost see her down in her own basement, listening to the same distant thunder and pretending it was far away. If I closed my eyes long enough, I could hear her humming the same song she used to sing while cooking. I held that sound in my chest until it hurt, because sometimes holding on is the only kind of strength left. Fischer finally spoke. He said reinforcements wouldn't come, that the city was surrounded now, that each street had become its own island. He told us that if we wanted to leave, he wouldn't stop us. No one moved, not out of courage, but because there was nowhere left to go. Lucas said softly, "Do you think they hate us?" No one answered at first. Then Fischer said, "Maybe, maybe not. Hate needs energy. I think they're just tired, like us." That sentence stayed with me. It changed something in the air, like truth always does when it's finally spoken aloud. We spent that day helping people who came to the basement. An old man who couldn't walk. A girl who had lost her shoes somewhere in the night. Emil found a blanket and covered her feet. Franz shared his last bit of bread. I realized then that even here, surrounded by everything falling apart, people still tried to build small moments of kindness. Maybe that's what keeps the world from ending completely, the tiny, invisible acts that never make it into history books. When the sun began to set again, the sky turned a bruised shade of orange. Somewhere far away, a bell was ringing, maybe a church, maybe something else. And in that strange half-light, Berlin didn't look like a battlefield anymore. It looked like a memory that didn't know how to fade. I walked up the stairs and stood in the doorway, breathing in the smell of dust and rain. There were no soldiers, no shouting, just the city exhaling. It was almost beautiful, almost. If you're still here, still listening, don't leave just yet. Because what comes next isn't about war anymore. It's about what people remember when the noise stops. And if this story has already found a place in your thoughts, stay with it. There's something I still need to tell you. The next morning came softly, as if it didn't want to be noticed. The air had changed, colder, thinner, the kind of air that belongs to endings. The sky was the color of worn-out paper, and everything beneath it looked like a letter that had been read too many times. Fischer gathered us in the narrow street. He spoke quietly, the way people do when they've already accepted something. "There will be no more orders," he said. "We do what we can where we are." He looked around at us, not as soldiers, but as sons, as someone who'd run out of ways to protect us. We nodded. Not because we understood, but because there was nothing left to argue with. We walked through streets that felt like they were watching us. The wind moved through broken windows and made a sound almost like whispers. Somewhere, someone was playing a piano, soft, uncertain notes drifting through the ruins like smoke. I remember thinking how strange it was that music still existed, even now. We passed a wall covered with chalk writing, names, messages, fragments of hope. "Anna is alive. We will meet by the river. Forgive us." I traced one of the sentences with my finger and felt the chalk dust against my skin. It made me wonder how many stories the city could hold before it forgot them all. By afternoon, clouds rolled in. Emil started humming again, a small tune that filled the space between the gusts of wind. It was something from before, from when we were boys who thought the world was permanent. No one told him to stop. The sound was fragile, but it kept the silence from feeling too big. We found shelter near an old library. Most of the books had fallen from their shelves, scattered across the floor like leaves that had tried to fly. Lucas picked one up, brushed the dust from its cover. It was a collection of poems, the pages yellowed and soft. He read one line aloud. "Even the smallest light is brighter when surrounded by night." He smiled, and for a moment, we all believed it. That night, Fisher sat with us by a candle. He spoke about the First War, how he had been our age then, how he had thought it would be glorious. He told us that wars don't end when the shooting stops. They end when people remember differently. "Promise me something," he said. "When this is over, if you live, tell it truthfully. Don't make it sound heroic. Tell it so people know what it costs." We promised, quietly. And maybe that's why I'm telling this now. If you've been with me this far, if any of this has made you stop and feel, stay until the end. Because the truth I learned in those days isn't about sides or nations. It's about the moment you realize that surviving doesn't always mean winning. The candle burned low. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, whispering the last lullaby of a city that had forgotten how to sleep. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid anymore. Not because I was brave, but because there was a kind of peace in finally understanding. We were only boys, and maybe that was enough to forgive everything that came before. Morning arrived without a sound. The city no longer roared, it murmured. The air smelled of damp stone and something almost clean. It felt as if Berlin itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. We walked through streets that were more shadow than stone. Somewhere a door creaked. Somewhere else, a bird tried a few notes, uncertain if song still belonged here. The war had emptied everything, yet that faint sound of life was enough to make us stop and listen. Fisher rested against a wall, eyes closed. "It's over," he said, though no one had told him. We could feel it, the strange stillness that follows a long fever. Nobody cheered. We simply stood there, 6 outlines in a city trying to remember what silence meant. Emil whispered that he wanted to go home. Franz nodded, clutching the strap of his rifle as if it were a suitcase handle. Lucas laughed once, softly, and said he didn't even know which way home was anymore. I thought of my mother, of the scarf she had given me. I pulled it from my coat pocket and breathed in the faint trace of soap and warmth that still clung to it. That scent was the real victory. Proof that kindness had survived the noise. Fisher looked at us one last time. "Go live," he said. "That's the only order left." And for the first time, the word order didn't sound like command. It sounded like forgiveness. We walked until our legs forgot the rhythm of marching. The streets opened into wide spaces where sunlight touched the ruins like a promise. I realized that the war hadn't taken everything. It had left us this, the chance to choose what kind of people we would become afterward. If you've stayed with me through all this, thank you. Because remembering isn't easy. It asks you to hold both the light and the dark in the same hand. And if this story moved something in you, don't let it fade. Keep it alive. Tell someone what it felt like to be 16 and suddenly older than your years. Share it so that the next time the world tries to turn children into soldiers, someone will remember how it sounds when a city full of voices finally goes quiet. We were only boys, but maybe that's why we understood something the grown-ups forgot. That peace isn't a treaty, it's the moment you decide not to hate. What would you have done if you were one of us? 6 boys standing in the ruins, hearing the first birds sing again. Tell me what you think. I'd like to know how the story lives inside you now.